Brad Lipps, CEO of the Atlas Network. How's it going?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me.
An ancient time ago, before this thing called COVID, we were talking about doing a show together to take a step back from the day-to-day shit show that we call the American political process to talk sort of long-term strategy about liberty, and then we got sort of swallowed up.
All this happened, yeah.
In the crisis. So here we are.
We're back, masks off, ready to go.
And I just reread your new book, and we'll be talking about this. Your new book is called The Freedom Movement. It's past, present, and future. I guess it's not as new as it would have been if we had done the show when we wanted to, but this came out about 3 or 4 months ago.
Yeah, we released it in February, and while I sort of wish that I was talking COVID in it, because it feels a little bit antiquated, but the questions that I tried to pose, I think, still endure, and in some ways are prescient. Some of the things that have happened in 2020 have sort of highlighted the need for some soul searching among all of us who love liberty, and hopefully it'll get people thinking in constructive ways.
The tone I like about the book, and I very much think this way, and I think all institutions and all movements get stuck in yesterday's way of doing things, and the tone in your book is very much, we need to constantly be questioning whether or not we're doing the right thing, whether or not we're achieving our goals, and being willing to take on sacred cows, even if they were once the most successful institutions of the freedom movement. So that's really cool. But before we do any of that, we are going to drink some beer.
Sounds good.
And in a mostly legal way, I brought these beers back from Anchorage Brewing Company. This is, in fact, their 10th anniversary special IPA.
Nice.
And it is absolutely fantastic. Anchorage Brewing is one of these breweries that I'm sort of really excited about. Unfortunately, to really get it, 9 times out of 10, you got to go to Alaska, and that's a burden. But
that makes it that much more special. And
we do what we need to do.
This is one of my favorite things about a visit to Kibbe Manor.
And you're a little bit of a beer geek, right?
I am, but I'd probably disappoint you with my daily habits of hydrating with Coors Light. But I always appreciate.
What? Cheers.
Cheers.
Not cheers to that, but cheers anyway.
Yeah, I know. I think your viewers should know about your generosity. When my wife was going through a cancer bout a couple of years ago, you guys were attentive to not just her needs, but the fact that I was wiped out, and a delivery of sort of crazy exotic IPAs on the front porch from you guys was keeping me going. That's silver lining of a tough year.
I have a theory that beer fixes most things, and tired husbands is one of them.
There you go. That's really good.
But yeah, I'm really excited about that beer and that brewery. And we actually went. Terry and I went to Alaska to escape the lockdowns in D.C. I think it's still true, but at the time, Alaska had opened up their economy, and we actually not only drank legally at a brew pub, a brewery, we legally saw a concert of one of our favorite musicians, the White Buffalo. So
nice.
It was a wildly liberating experience. And it reminded me never to take for granted even the most mundane aspects of liberty, because there is some authoritarian wannabe somewhere that's looking to take it away.
Indeed.
Which is a nice, do you see how beautiful that segue was to this book? So there's a tradition on my show that, and I always say this, and it's actually true. I can prove it on social media, but certain loyal viewers of this show, every time we quote Hayek, they have to drink. Mm-hmm. So it's a Hayek drinking show. So we should probably do the same.
I think I do open up with a Hayek quote pretty early on. So yeah, this could get sloppy.
Well, that's the idea. I've always wanted to replace this show with a concept I have called drunk Austrian economics, where you would explain complex Austrian business cycle theory by drinking lots and lots of alcohol to see if it actually made more sense.
That is a niche market idea, but yeah,
it's
there's something
niche-y,
there.
Super niche. I think I'd be the only audience, but this your book is really a revisiting of what I think is probably one of Hayek's more important strategic essays, The Intellectuals and Socialism. And you returned me on to this essay. You don't know this, but I got really obsessed with it about a year ago when you assigned it as reading to free market CEOs. And I reread it, and I hadn't read it for I don't know how many years. But there's a lot of, I think, really relevant insights to what we need to do next as people that advocate freedom. And I want to get into that, but I just realized that perhaps not everybody watching this knows a lot about the Atlas Network. You're the CEO of the Atlas Network. You've been there a long time. Give us an overview of what that is.
Yeah, in a nutshell, Atlas Network is a nonprofit based just across the river in Virginia. It's been around for about 40 years now, and it's really in the business of serving a community of independent think tanks that don't take orders from us, but that opt into our programs because we sort of believe we all get better together. So we have, I think, the world's best training programs for think tanks committed to liberty. We run grant competitions because donors trust that we can find high impact projects to advance the cause. And then, through our communications arm and through events we run around the world, we really try to build a sense of camaraderie. And we try to put a fine point at what we think is really excellent work that's changing the game for the liberty movement and actually giving people more opportunity by reforming public policies in an exciting way. And my belief is that that's the kind of thing that makes everybody in this movement take note of how much better they could be. And that's the kind of thing that inspires more ambition, more effectiveness. So that's the reason for our organization to try to just stoke the ambitions and help people learn from one another in this sort of interesting, peer-oriented way.
Yeah, I've been to a number of Atlas Network conferences across the globe. My wife, Terry, who is actually the CEO of Free the People, and my boss, both in life and in business. She's been to a lot more, and there's something really special. I would call it a sense of community that I get when people from a region, and I've been in Mumbai for the Asia Liberty Forum. I've been in Johannesburg for the African Liberty Forum, and it's inspiring on two levels. One is that there is a sense that we're all in this together. There's none of that sort of petty competition that sometimes you get in libertarian circles, and in any movement you get that sort of human competition. But the other thing I learned is that as much friendly fire that you've taken as the CEO of Atlas Network as I've taken in various things that I've done, you realize that young people fighting for liberty in Africa, this is not a hobby. This is not necessarily a safe thing for them to do. They are taking on very dangerous authoritarians, and they're wanting to change the world. So I sort of get refueled every time I go to one of those events, and unfortunately under COVID, we haven't had a chance to connect with the global liberty movement physically in quite some time.
Right. Yeah, and we have a lot of partners here in the U.S., but I think that the global dimension of Atlas Network is what is really unique, and it's tough to explain why it's so inspiring. But for me, when I got into this 22, 23 years ago, my first job in D.C. was with a think tank working on electricity deregulation. And, I think all that's important, but that wasn't going to change the hearts and minds of my old college friends that thought that I was, being used by, capitalist exploiters to do something nefarious. When I started to go to Atlas things and get involved with the organization, I realized that the people from Southeast Asia and from Africa and Eastern Europe who can talk from personal experience about what it's like to live under totalitarian systems, what it's like to live in the kind of poverty that we just don't experience in the U.S., and they come back to the same principles, the same criticisms of big government. That helps you look at things anew. And people that, people on the left might think, oh, obviously we're in support of them because they're so sympathetic. It's great when the messages from there are more about, appreciate human dignity and how free enterprise unlocks it, and how, aid to government tends to diminish it. So I think it can be a game changer in how you look at things.
And some of your partners, specifically in China, but I know libertarian organizations in Putin's Russia, in the Middle East, they've been shut down, they've been jailed, and it's not. This is not a non-serious risk that they're taking.
Yeah, it's also incredibly humbling, and then one of the great things is that the spirit of community where they say, "But your work is important too." I remember my brother, when he first came to one of our events, he was sitting with Venezuelan businessmen, and this is back in sort of early Hugo Chavez days, and he was like, "Oh my God, these guys are like, I feel like I'm talking with the Captain Von Trapp, like just debating whether he can stay in his country or needs to flee it." And then when they asked my brother, what he was up to, and he was working on the Tabor amendments that were a big thing back, in the early 2000s. But he explained it in a self-deprecating way, saying, "Well, I'm trying to keep government from, to grow at, this kind of an angle instead of this kind of an." And they said, like, don't diminish the importance. Like, if the U.S. messes it up,
right,
it's over.
It's all a glide path to authoritarianism, and I think one of the problems we have in our country is that we're so damn spoiled. We're not really used to government destroying our lives, and we're very wealthy, and in a lot of ways, maybe elections don't matter that much to us. But that's starting to change, and one of the things going on right now, which I think is an opportunity, is the conversation about the monopoly power of police and the disparate outcomes of our justice system, which is something that sort of transcends left versus right. It transcends conservatives and liberal, and we libertarians are kind of saying, guys, we've been talking about the dangers of government power for a long time. This is an opportunity to understand why that cop thought he had the power to do what he did.
Right. Yeah, and it's been interesting to see some of the ideas that have been kicked around by organizations here in the U.S. that are part of this broad liberty movement are suddenly coming to the fore, and there's suddenly much more attention to things like police unions. I tend to be one of those that thinks that we shouldn't be stereotyping all police based on the actions of some really horrific things that have happened. But when we have to wonder why it's so difficult to separate the good from the bad, and it's interesting to see more attention going to some of these structural causes. And as you said, one of the things I think is so exciting is this opportunity to have conversations across the aisle at a time that has been, that's so polarizing. My big hope, and it's part of the question that I try to ask in this freedom movement monograph, is what's the big tent that unites all of us over the next decade and beyond? I have a feeling it's not going to be the same coalition that Bill Buckley envisioned back in the 50s and 60s that kind of came to fruition with Ronald Reagan. We have to be really open to have conversations with others that are earnestly grappling for solutions. And that's the fun part of this.
You gently nudge people that are pining for the so-called Reagan coalition. You're like, that was a long time ago, and the new coalition's going to be something else. You and I are both members of a mostly progressive working group, and we're both sort of open to learning and listening and looking for those untraditional allies. And a big initiative of the Atlas Network is on poverty elimination and challenging, what I would call the poverty industrial complex. Give us a quick overview of that.
Yeah, sure. So this is a project that really began looking abroad. It's fun that we're now pivoting to see if the implications from what we've learned can be applied to low-income communities here in the U.S. But the basic idea is that there's a lot of people who understand that traditional foreign aid has bred a lot more corruption and a lot more dependency than it has in helping the intended populations become self-sufficient and begin to thrive. That criticism, I think, has become much more broadly accepted among mainstream economists and members of the left than in the past. And there's more of an appreciation for how economic freedom is part of the solution. I love, like, Bono back in like 2012 or so, sort of said, yeah, look, rock star preaching capitalism. We know that I can't believe that I'm saying that aid is a band-aid, entrepreneurship is the cure. And what I think what is still the missing piece, though, is that a lot of people that are invested in what you call, the aid industrial complex believe that they still need to be the ones in charge of how these countries reform. We have the luxury of having spent so much time with this really decentralized network of civil society organizations that have read a lot of the same books as you and I, that believe in economic freedom, but they have the local knowledge about what is going to stick, how to make it happen, how to make sure it doesn't exist just on paper. And if we can get over this hubris that people from the West need to solve others' problems, and we just realize our challenge is to help identify and put some wind under the wings of those that have local vision to increase economic freedom, that's going to be the game changer. So that's what we've tried to do with a project that now has the tagline "Dignity Unbound." In part because we also are realizing it's not just about economic growth and some of the metrics that the wonks here in DC like, but this is a matter of just individual dignity, about owning your own home. Being able to work in the formal economy and not have to hide from the police. There's dignity issues that are at the heart of all this.
I love that word, and I'm going to go off on a tangent, and I swear eventually we're actually talking about your book without talking about it, but dignity is a word that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Democratic Socialist, everybody knows who she is, but she talks a lot about economic dignity, and it struck me that in a world, particularly in the United States, where very few people actually wake up in the morning wondering whether or not they can feed their families. I mean, we still have poverty, but compared to the rest of the world, we're a wildly wealthy country, and COVID lockdowns have done a tremendous amount of damage, and I think we'll be dealing with increased poverty in our country. But as we get more wealthy and healthy, as we know that there's a link between these two things, that the search for meaning and sort of spiritual meaning in what you do and how you live your life and all that stuff, and what AOC would call dignity, is everything. And I think this is a place where there is leverage to engage people left of center. There's leverage, I think, across the political spectrum, because to me there's only one path to dignity, and that's self-ownership and the freedom to pursue happiness and the freedom to pursue enterprise, and all of these things that lead to a fulfilling life. It's not a government can't give you dignity. You can't pass legislation that mandates dignity. You have to set people free to pursue that. Right.
And I think that part of the challenge here is how do you talk in a way that really addresses the sense of injustice that people do, I think, rightfully feel. I think that people from free market of a free market inclination tend not to talk about things like inequality, because they know that the income inequality debate is kind of a red herring, and the way the stats are laid out is kind of misleading. But there's something that I think is wrong about us rejecting the idea that we should care about inequalities. Because there are inequalities that matter, which tends to be things like, do you have access to a good school? Things that matter to people that don't really understand that it's political privileges and monopolies that are set up by government that are really depriving them of the opportunities they should have. So I like to think that we should be talking about inequalities that matter. Get beyond some of these Gini coefficients about how the top's doing versus the bottom. That's kind of irrelevant. Let's talk about things that are on their face unjust, and where anybody should have some empathy for those who are struggling with few options for their kids.
Yeah, and so I've never thought to rehabilitate the word inequality, but the way you present it makes a lot of sense to me, because, and when I get at words like justice and community and dignity and democracy and all of these words that the left uses very comfortably, and perhaps from my perspective incorrectly. When you get at the real issue of haves and have-nots, it's those who have access to power, those who collude with the government to carve out special privileges and push other people out. Yeah. And it's very much a have and have-nots, because Jeff Bezos always has a seat at the table. If you're selling single cigarettes on a street corner in New York City, you have no power. And I think that's an opportunity to talk to the left, and you talk about that in the book, and you challenge us to think about things outside of the tribal language that free marketeers love to use.
Yeah, and I think another dimension of this is trying to listen for those who have kind of come to our conclusions, even though they didn't bow down in front of some of our favorite economists. That we can wish that everybody was part of an F.A. Hayek fan club.
There we go.
Ready?
Right there. Cheers.
Do you like how I worked that? And I'm learning, Matt.
You actually have to chug the beer every time I say spontaneous order.
Oh man. Okay. I'll be getting ready for that. But at the end of the day, getting people to earn more appreciation for Friedrich Hayek is not the point. The point is.
That's a little sacrilegious. I don't know if I'm comfortable with that, but translating our ideas and our heroes and even economics into values-based common sense, in this case English, but whatever the language may be that we're trying to translate as part of that. And one of the things I noticed in your book, you sort of break down the freedom movement, and Atlas is really part of, it's kind of the latter half, but the first generation OG liberty movement think tanks, and it's based on a conversation, or at least a letter that Friedrich Hayek sent to Anthony Fisher. Tell that story.
Yeah, so our founding story is one that I love to tell. We were founded by a guy who was a Royal Air Force pilot in World War II, a Brit named Anthony Fisher. And after the war ended, he was in the Battle of Britain, saw his brother shot down in front of him. When they'd won the war, suddenly Britain was, electing a labor government and doing things that he thought were the opposite of what he'd been fighting for. He thought they were fighting for individual liberty and a tradition of individualism that was suddenly being discarded. And he came across The Road to Serfdom, actually not the book version, but Reader's Digest published an abridged version of Friedrich Hayek's great book. And he learned that Hayek was down the street at the London School of Economics. So he sought him out and said, I've read the book, you've diagnosed the problem, I'm running for Parliament to make things right. And, I'd imagine that Hayek could have just politely said, go get him, boy, and gotten on with his work. But instead he said, this is a bad idea. You're going to fail as a politician if your goal is to reverse intellectual trends. You're either going to not be elected because you're out of sync with the times, or you're going to compromise in ways that make you ineffective at reversing this intellectual current that was then leading Britain further towards socialism. So Fisher walked out discouraged, but found his way towards a really lucrative business career. He sort of became the Frank Perdue of the UK, and 10 years later put the profits into what became the first free market think tank in the UK. Fee here in the US is a little bit older, but we're talking 1955 when the organization started. And then 25 years later, after being laughed at for many of those years, Margaret Thatcher said, the platform that we've run on, that we've won on, and that we're now implementing really is due to the intellectual foundations that came from the IEA and others that started to look at, well, how do you, denationalize, privatize certain aspects of what had happened in the UK.
And sooner after that, he created the Atlas Network, and Hayek said that's a great idea because what you've done in the UK needs to be replicated.
Yeah, so in the book, I actually reprint the copy that we have of a 1980 letter that Hayek then wrote to say, the IEA in London, that first think tank, has been more effective than I ever would have imagined. You may have hit upon the secret recipe for how we can save the world from creeping socialism. I applaud your idea to replicate the experiment wherever it can happen, and that was the impetus for the creation of Atlas Network in 1981, which doesn't operate as a think tank itself, but which tries to help the experiment be replicated in ways that are sort of appropriate for those local conditions.
Yeah. And that gets to your update of that model in this book, because what the data that I saw of the Atlas Network, I think 80+% of the organizations in your network now consider themselves doing grassroots. Mm-hmm. They produce intellectual analysis, they produce policy research, which would have been the traditional IEA model, but they're now doing grassroots engagement, and I assume in addition to that, just communicating directly.
Right.
Because today you don't have to get the New York Times to run your piece. You can communicate directly with citizens, and to me, that's I would have to assume that Hayek would be wholeheartedly for that, but he could not have imagined a world where things like that were possible, because he understood a very rigid intellectual structure of production where he wanted to influence the intellectuals because they controlled all the levers of communication.
Yeah, one of the things that's definitely changed over my 20 years at Atlas Network is, just we've seen the information explosion. So there's no longer this scarcity of information, so that the ideas themselves are, that need to be hammered out and manufactured. Now the challenge is that we have an abundance of information, and you need ways to cut through the clamor that's there. And the democratization of production and distribution of media has given rise to things like Free the People, and you're able to reach audiences in much more direct ways, and I think meaningful ways. So it's really interesting to see this evolution, and it just is a continual reminder that we're all sort of entrepreneurs in this world, and if your approach to entrepreneurship is just copying what you've seen somebody else do, because you're just gonna that must have worked, so I'm going to do what they do without thinking through whether it still matters or how the market's changing, you're going to be left behind. So the real reason for this book is just to make us get real intentional about our strategies and to open up some discussions. And at the same time, hopefully, for people that are unfamiliar with this idea of like a freedom movement, to give them a nice little primer about how it's evolved, what we're trying to do, and to convince them this is rewarding stuff and not that kooky.
Yeah, it reminds me of something Miles Davis not just argued. He very much argued in the context of good jazz music that in order to, and this is a Hayekian point. You didn't know that Miles Davis was a Hayekian, but
yeah,
cheers to that. Yeah.
Cheers to that.
Miles Davis is a very classically trained musician. He knew how to do all of the technically correct things. And it wasn't until John Coltrane started breaking a lot of rules that he sort of forced Miles Davis to reinvent himself, which he did again and again and again. And what Hayek would say about Miles Davis, I'm really butchering history right now, is that in order to break a rule, you have to follow some rules. So if you want to understand how to reinvent the liberty movement, you're going to have to at least understand the conversation that Anthony Fisher and Frederick Hayek had in the context of that. And this the thing that you quote again and again in this book, and I'll assign it to everybody watching this show. I've done it before. Read Hayek's short essay, The Intellectuals and Socialism, and you will discover how fresh it is, even though it was written in the 1940s.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And he says a couple things, and I'd love to go through these and have you translate them in the context of what you guys are doing every day. But one of the first rules he says is don't mock your intellectual enemies. Take them seriously. Engage them on ideas. Mm-hmm. Why? Why can't I just post memes and make fun of them?
Well, I think this is sort of a live question. So there's part of our movement that I think has become very much about, let's own the libs and show the hypocrisy. That's
Get the clicks.
yeah, and I don't want to say that that's an illegitimate way to spend your time. There's something that is really cathartic about it, and firing up people in the pews is worthwhile. But if we're really going to change hearts and minds, and we're really looking to the future where we could accomplish something meaningful, it's crazy to be creating this animosity that can't be bridged. So I think that what Hayek did in The Road to Serfdom, dedicating it to the socialists of all parties, showed this it wasn't a mocking, teasing, the socialism of all parties. It was a legitimate, hey, I think I have something to contribute to this conversation. Join me.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the right disposition.
And there's always a difference between the intellectual leaders of a movement and people in the public that are trying to figure out how the world works and are attracted to certain things, based on whatever. And I would draw the distinction between teachers unions versus teachers unions who are about power and maybe not so much about helping kids, versus teachers who are very much doing the best they can to teach children within the confines of a system. Good cops trying to work within a system where bad cops can't be fired. And in this case, socialist leaders, some of whom might be quite noxious, versus people that are like, this idea of democratic socialism sounds kind of right to me, because I'm looking at the nationalist right, and it's like, that doesn't feel quite right.
Right.
So we have to, if you don't engage the ideas seriously, you're walking away, not from perhaps entrenched intellectuals, but from people that are struggling to figure stuff out. And if you just sound like another person that's like on tribe B instead of tribe A, I think you particularly lose young people.
Yeah, and I guess I have the benefit of having kind of been there and back. I was raised by wonderful sort of Reaganite parents, but all the bands I liked in the late '80s and early '90s convinced me that I was just super unfashionable by being that way. And I remember being at a Mekons concert on the night that Thatcher lost power, and I was kind of with them, just kind of maybe. I don't know if the socialism works in practice, but this idea of sharing and being above self-interest, maybe if enough of us believe it, it'll work. And
it was cooler at the Mekons concert to not be down with Thatcher.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I was kind of suspending my disbelief, turning off a part of my brain that was going to ask well, is it going to work or not? And I was like, no, if our intentions are good, so it'll. So I think there's a lot of people that are fight the power. There's a lot of people that are in that camp, I think, that haven't thought things through. I was a pretty smart kid, but I had not thought things through in a meaningful way. And you have to be open to the idea that there's a lot of people out there that might be on the wrong side of the divide right now, but who are earnestly trying to do what's right.
Another one of Hayek's. I'm translating Hayek's essay into rules, which he would probably be upset with, but I'm cool with that. Another point that he makes that I think is pretty fundamental is that don't fall into a trap, and he didn't say it this way, but settling for the lesser of two evils, as if you're defending one political regime because the other one would be much worse, and it ultimately sounds like you're just defending the status quo. And I think a lot of libertarians struggle with this in the United States today, because you can look at Trump and everyone sort of jokingly says, but Gorsuch, but this, but that. And one of the traps I think that free marketeers fall into is sort of in a practical level, settling for the lesser of two evils, or at least appearing as if you're with them, and it's really not true. And Hayek's like, don't do that, because you look like you're for the status quo.
Yeah, I think that one of the real tough things is that the news that we're saturated in, the conversations that you necessarily have to have if you're in this world tend to be about what's happening in Washington and the latest tweet and the latest soundbite, and it's so not constructive. And I think that our big challenge is to hear that noise. We can't be oblivious to what's going on around us, but to understand that a lot of it's noise. Sometimes I will get sort of partisan passions going into an election, and then I realize that, when Obama was elected, I was worried. I never saw that there's going to be also this kind of counter trend of people getting involved with the Tea Party and waving pocket constitutions, and there's no victory tends to be complete. And when the Tea Party was moving, I thought, wow, the GOP is moving in a constitutionalist direction, and then Trump happened. So I've learned that focusing on the elections that are coming up tends to be distracting, and that if you're legitimately trying to build an ideological movement that will have influence over time, it's a different project entirely.
And by the way, that doesn't mean, at least in my case, and everyone will have a different opinion about this, that doesn't mean you don't work with people in power. And I at least have always been willing to work with Republicans and Democrats, because in our country, that's who's making policy decisions, and you try not to be partisan about that. And I think that's fine, as long as you don't become a tool for their agendas.
Right. I think that most of what I've learned in life is that there's always some tension, and that it's rare that you can say, it's this way or that way. There's things that you have to hold in balance. So part of the Hayek essay concludes with him talking about the courage to be utopian, saying this is what made socialism appealing, and we have to figure out how to make this intellectual project around classical liberalism as visionary, that it's going to capture the imaginations of all these young people. And lots of people in our circles push back on that, because utopianism is sort of not the way that we think of the world. We know that human nature is imperfect, and that the constitutional construct we have is to try to limit the damage that individuals can have. So it's tough to picture that utopian vision, but I think that there's something there about painting an optimistic vision that's super compelling. At the same time, if we just kind of are painting this, Galt's Gulch for the Randians among us, we lose sight of the fact that sometimes incremental wins that by themselves don't feel that meaningful, they're what build momentum. They're what get you a seat at the table for the next big discussion. So I think we live in this balance of trying to have the courage to be a utopian, but also be really practical, get meaningful things done, prove that we're serious and can have conversations with normal people, and that we're not just grandstanding for the sake of grandstanding.
It's funny that a lot of Austrians who tend to be sort of anarcho-capitalist libertarians always view Hayek as the squish, but that particular, and that would be the final rule in that essay is think big, be radical in your vision, think utopian, and that's music to my ears, because I think you can have a diversity, you can have a structure of production, but if our vision isn't big and beautiful and moral and compelling to people at Mekong concerts,
right?
You got nothing. You got nothing, because most people don't consume the daily data that the world throws at them through the economics of supply and demand.
Yeah,
I'm the weirdo. I do that, and it drives my wife crazy. But that's not how normal people think. They consume stories and emotions and beautiful visions about making a better future, which brings us full circle back to your battle against poverty, because that's a utopian vision.
Uh-huh.
And you and I know from economics that poverty is the natural state of human existence. And there's something that happens that lifts us out of that, and it ain't a multinational bureaucracy.
Right. And I think that this is maybe newly relevant in the wake of economic devastation that the pandemic has brought. And from where I sit, it's interesting that people's instinct, this is just like baked into our DNA, is often, what's the government program that's going to solve this? Are the checks going to continue? while we're unemployed and dislocated. But in reality, I think what we've experienced has been sort of this, Greta Thunberg vision has been realized for the last 4 months or so. And this idea of no mobility, limited trade, all these barriers, this isn't exactly a beautiful post-capitalist utopia.
Yeah.
This is like a real experience in what does not work. And I think that there should be our moment here. We should be able to make the case that the resilience of societies depends upon the flexibility of private enterprise and civil society actors to try to solve problems where we have enough information to solve problems. And the idea that you can, hate everything that Trump does and at the same time look to government to solve your problems is just so perverse that I can't believe we can't make this case better, Matt.
Well, it's unfortunately every crisis creates an opportunity, and we need more beer, by the way.
We
so
do.
So
I'm
we're going to
gonna
drink
finish
all
this
this
one up,
before we wrap up the program. This one, by the way, is an other half double dry hop, double IPA, 8.5% alcohol.
Is this Alaska or is this one of your Richmond?
No, this is Brooklyn.
Brooklyn. Okay.
Brooklyn.
I'm digging in.
We still drink in the lower 48. But this should be an opportunity, like Obama's chief of staff famously said, "Never let a crisis go to waste." And unfortunately, government has created a massive economic crisis above and beyond what the COVID-19 pandemic would have done. It would have created a lot of chaos, but the real impact of that, and I get so crazy about this. This is why I spent 3 months just railing against lockdowns. Is it's not a problem for you and me. Mm-hmm. We work in the ideas industry, and I distribute the content of Free the People through technology, and eventually the economy will shrink so much that it'll impact us. But for people that are unemployed today, and more importantly, for people that are at the margin in, let's say, India.
Right.
A lot of hunger going on in India. Man-made hunger created by stupid government policies. We really want people that care about the poor to think about what happens at the margin when government does stupid things. And we just have to figure out how to make that argument, because right now there's this emotional idea that, well, let's just shut everything down until we're safe, mm-hmm. which would kill so many people.
Yeah, it's one of those classic lessons of Friedrich Bastiat, the unseen costs of any policy. So if you're going to prioritize the goal of no COVID-related deaths, but you're completely oblivious to all the other dislocations, all the challenges of people being locked at home with abusive husbands, and all just there's so many different things that a free people, if they were able to navigate these trade-offs themselves, might handle differently than the mandates. It's kind of awe-inspiring at how much complexity there is. And I don't like to be a reflexive, anarcho-capitalist that says there's no role for government during a public health crisis. This is one of those unique situations where a coordinated response of some level may have been necessary, but the temptation to lock down forever and to over-prescribe is something that we, as part of a movement, need to be guarded against.
Yeah, I tend to be more pessimistic about government action, because it strikes me that almost everything that we've done in our country has been 100% motivated by politics. Mm-hmm. And politics is a horrible way to mitigate really complex, unknowable things. And this virus is a complex, unknowable thing. And I wanted to see a decentralized response that took the threat and also the consequences of our actions more seriously. But
yeah.
Those are and that I just made an argument that's probably not compelling to anybody, and that's the challenge of our movement, is like, how do we convince people that our policies are actually more compassionate, they're more pro-human, they're actually pro-dignity. What do you think the future is? You've talked a lot about the diversity of the Atlas Network movement, but what do we got to do next? How do I get to Galt's Gulch?
Yeah. Well, I guess that my refrain, and this could be a cop-out, is that I don't believe there's, a silver bullet, and I really appreciate the idea there's going to be this multiplicity of strategies that move us forward. But some of the common refrains, I think, is that arguments that are simply about economic efficiency are going to fail. In a world of increasing abundance, people take for granted that they're going to be able to get by one way or another, and the quest for meaning in their lives is much more salient than am I going to make ends meet?
Yeah.
And that, I think, means that if we're not really focusing on the storytelling aspects of what we're doing and showing that there are these questions of human dignity at the heart of policy challenges, then we're sort of missing the boat. So part of what I really hope we can do is figure out how to be striking alliances with unlikely allies, at the same time, not co-opting our principles, staying really true to the kind of ideas that Hayek and Anthony Fisher expounded and said, we don't care if they're politically relevant. They're sort of the North Star that we can't, that we need to stay true to. But having conversations with people that are outside of our normal movement and learning how to talk to them in a more constructive way seems to be at the heart of the challenge.
Okay, so the homework assignment is get this book.
There you go.
The Freedom Movement, Its Past, Present, and Future.
It's super short. I thought it was going to be like the perfect airplane read, and then they shut down all the people stopped using airplanes. So
well, I love that.
Time to get back to it.
And by the way, this gives me hope for the future that you didn't write a 1,000-page tome on the Freedom Movement, because that's sort of an example of what we don't need to do right now.
Right.
But where would people get this book?
So you can get a physical copy on Amazon. You can download it for free at atlasnetwork.org. If you go to sort of the news and analysis bar and click on Freedom Movement, you can get it for free.
And I assume we go to the same place to learn more about the Atlas Network partners, one of the best of which happens to be Free the People, but there's a lot of best within the
There's a lot of them, but certainly, yeah, Free the People is a favorite.
We're slightly better than Maguette Wade, who called me out at the last Atlas Network
That was one of my favorite moments of all time at an Atlas event, so yeah.
Actually, I'm afraid whenever Maguette gets mad at me, I'm a little bit afraid that she's going to kick my ass.
You're not alone in that.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
Thanks. Great to be here, Matt.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.